He invited her to a ball to be the laughingstock of New York's elite, a kneeling maid mopping the floor, dressed in a ball gown among the city's most powerful criminals. The entire ballroom erupted in laughter. But that night, when the crystal chandelier shone down and a trembling old mob boss pointed directly at her, his voice cracking like glass, no one laughed anymore. Because the man recognized the pendant around her neck, and he knew that the bloodline they thought they had buried 10 years earlier was still alive. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has progressed. And stay until the end, because this isn't the worst that happened that night. The Virelli estate didn't feel like a home. It never had, not to anyone who actually lived inside it. It felt like a museum built by a man who wanted to be feared rather than remembered. 32 rooms spread across 4 floors of Manhattan's Upper East Side, all of it dressed in cold marble and darker money. The chandeliers were Venetian. The rugs were hand-knotted in Isfahan and cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The walls held paintings that hadn't been looked at in years because the man who owned this place didn't care about art. He cared about what the art communicated to the people who came here to be intimidated. Damien Virelli had been raised to understand that power was a language, and that every surface of a room could speak it. Elena Vale had spent 8 months learning to make herself invisible in that language. She was on her knees in the East Corridor at 10:30 on a Thursday night, working a horsehair brush along the grout lines between marble tiles, when she heard the party begin to fracture above her. The dinner was winding down. She could tell from the way footsteps shifted, the clink of glasses growing more sporadic, laughter loosening into the sloppy register that meant people were drinking past their dignity. She kept her head down and kept working. The brush moved in the same direction each time, left to right, methodical. She had learned early that methodical was the best form of camouflage in a house like this. She was 24 years old, and she had been scrubbing other people's floors since she was 19. At least, that was what her employment files said. The Virelli household employed 11 full-time domestic staff and rotated 4 additional cleaners through on a weekly contract. Elena had come through the contract rotation first, 18 months ago, and had quietly angled herself into a permanent position by the 4th month. She did this by being unremarkable. She arrived early, left late, never complained, never asked questions, never made eye contact with anyone above the rank of senior housekeeper. She wore the gray uniform with the white collar that made all the maids look interchangeable, and she kept her dark hair pulled back so tight it flattened the structure of her face. She had worked very hard to look like someone you'd never bother to remember. Upstairs, something broke. Not glass, something heavier. A chair, maybe, or the edge of a table catching someone's hip. Then came the kind of laughter that had a victim in it. Elena didn't stop moving the brush. There was a man named Rourke, one of Damien's personal security staff, who sometimes came down to the service corridors to smoke when the ventilation in the staff bathroom wasn't working. He told her once, without meaning to tell her anything useful, that the Thursday dinners were where Damien Virelli conducted what Rourke called his real business. The catered events, the charity functions, the press appearances, those were theater. The Thursday dinners were where deals were made, where debts were collected, where a man could find himself agreeing to something he hadn't intended to agree to before the appetizers arrived. Elena had filed that information and kept scrubbing. She heard footsteps on the staircase above the corridor, multiple sets moving fast, with the deliberate energy of men who needed to be somewhere but couldn't appear to be rushing. Then a door opened somewhere above her, and the ambient sound of the dinner spilled down through the walls like water finding cracks. Absolutely insufferable, Damien. You bring nothing every single year. A man in your position, no companion, it looks like weakness. You're afraid of women. Admit it. More laughter, the kind that had a point to it. Elena paused the brush for just a moment. Not out of curiosity. She was calibrating sound the way she'd taught herself to do, parsing which voices were positioned where, whether anyone was moving toward the staircase she'd need to use to reach the supply closet in the next 10 minutes. Then came Damien Virelli's voice, and the temperature of the corridor seemed to drop 3 degrees. Afraid. He said it the way you'd say a word in a foreign language you hadn't decided whether to learn yet. That's interesting. She knew his voice by now. 8 months of proximity to a man who rarely raised it had taught her that the quieter it went, the more dangerous the register. He didn't shout. Shouting required effort, and Damien Varelli never applied effort to the act of intimidation. It would have implied he needed to. "Bring someone, then," one of the other voices said. Male, slightly drunk, carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd been born rich and had never once been punished for his mouth. "The Black Veil is in 4 days. Bring someone or the whole city will keep laughing at you." A pause. Long enough that Elena began moving the brush again. Then footsteps. One set, unhurried, moving to the top of the east staircase. She was already shifting her weight back, starting to rise, when she heard him stop on the landing above her. She looked up. Reflex, not intention. Her eyes moved before she could stop them. He was standing at the top of the stairs with one hand on the banister, and he was looking directly at her. Damien Varelli was 36, with the kind of face that had been called handsome so many times it had started to look like a verdict rather than an observation. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes the color of deep water that hadn't seen light in years. He was in a dinner jacket that probably cost more than her entire existence, and he was looking at her the way you looked at a piece of furniture you'd been meaning to move. Behind him, the men from the party had followed him to the landing, leaning over the balustrade with their expensive drinks, watching. "You," Damien said. Elena waited. She held the brush at her side. She kept her face neutral, not passive, not submissive, just neutral, the expression of someone who had spent years curating blankness into armor. "What's your name?" "Elena," she said. "Sir." One of the men behind him snorted. Another said something low that she couldn't quite catch, but the laughter that followed it didn't require translation. "Elena." Damien said it like he was testing the weight of it. Then, "You'll attend the Black Veil Gala with me. 4 days from tonight." She heard the laughter ripple through the group behind him, full and unguarded, the way wealthy people laughed when they were certain no one present had the power to make them regret it. A maid. He was going to bring a maid. To the Black Veil. She could hear them already composing the anecdote they'd tell at the next dinner, the next party, the next gathering of people who found this kind of cruelty entertaining. Elena looked at him for 1 second longer than was probably wise. His eyes were waiting for her to flinch. "As you wish, sir," she said. She looked back down at the floor and resumed moving the brush. It took another 4 seconds before she heard him walk away from the landing. The other men were already pulling him back toward the dining room, their voices overlapping with speculation and delight. She listened to the sound of them recede and calculated very precisely how much had just changed. Then she kept scrubbing the grout until the corridor was clean. She didn't sleep well, which wasn't new. The staff quarters on the 3rd floor were adequate without being comfortable. She had a room to herself, which she'd arranged deliberately in the early months by making it quietly known that she was a light sleeper who'd disturbed previous roommates. She needed the privacy. What she kept in this room couldn't be explained by the biography she'd constructed. There was a false panel in the bottom of the wardrobe behind the spare uniform folded at the back. Inside it, a burner phone with a single contact stored under a number rather than a name. A USB drive wrapped in black electrical tape. A photograph, old and creased along the fold lines, of a man with a strong jaw and tired eyes sitting across from a young girl at a table covered in papers. The man was her father. The girl was herself at 12 years old. The photograph was the only sentimental thing she'd allowed herself to carry. Everything else in the panel was evidence, notes, dates, partial ledger entries she'd transcribed by hand from documents she'd accessed over 8 months of careful, patient, invisible work. She hadn't come to the Varelli estate looking for employment. She'd come here looking for a specific set of financial records that she had reason to believe were stored somewhere in this building. Records that connected 4 of New York's most powerful crime families to the engineered destruction of the Vail Holdings Group, the systematic dismantling of her father's financial empire, and his death 3 days after the bankruptcy was declared. She'd been 19 when her father died. The official finding was cardiac arrest. She had never once believed that. She sat on the edge of the bed with the photograph in her hands and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to remember what it had felt like before. before the lawyers and the creditors and the public humiliation of watching a name that had meant something reduced to a punchline in the financial press. Before the apartment was seized, before her father stopped sleeping and started staring at walls, before the end. Then she put the photograph away and began planning what the next 4 days required. She had not expected the gala opportunity. It was, objectively, both the most dangerous thing that could happen and the most useful. The Black Veil was not a charity event, regardless of how it was described in the society columns. She knew enough about it from research and from fragments of conversation she'd collected in 8 months of careful listening. It was an annual gathering of the city's interconnected criminal and political machinery, hosted, rotated, attended by the kind of people who never appeared in federal indictments because they were careful enough to position other people between themselves and every transaction that mattered. The guest list read like a map of the city's real power. Politicians who wrote the laws, financiers who funded the campaigns, men who ran organizations that didn't have official names. It was exactly the kind of room where the conspiracy that destroyed her family had been planned, and Damien Varelli had just handed her a ticket inside it. She understood the terms of his offer. She was not naive about what he intended. He wanted to walk into that room with a maid on his arm, not a date, not a companion, but a prop designed to demonstrate that his indifference to social expectation was so absolute he couldn't even be bothered to perform the basic theater of status. The mockery would attach to her and slide off him. She would be the punchline. He would be the man too powerful to care. She had dealt with worse positioning. What she needed was 4 days and a plan that could survive contact with a room full of people who would look at her and see a target. She could not look like a maid at the Black Veil. Not because she was ashamed of what she'd been doing, the performance had cost her more than anyone in this building would ever understand. But because invisibility served her in the corridors of this estate, and visibility, the right kind of visibility, was what the gala required. She needed to be seen. She needed to be legible. She needed people in that room to encounter her and feel the specific discomfort of encountering someone they couldn't categorize quickly. That was something she knew how to do. She had been learning it her whole life, before everything else had been stripped away. But the next 2 days passed in the particular tension of things left unsaid. The household staff had heard about the gala invitation. News moved through the Varelli estate the way weather moved through old buildings, through the gaps in walls and the spaces under doors, and the particular quality of silence that gathered in a corridor where someone had recently been speaking quietly. She felt their reactions without looking for them. A coolness from the senior housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, whose opinion of Elena had always been one of disinterested management, but who now carried something slightly more pointed in her efficiency. Looks from the other maids, not cruel exactly, but charged with the particular tension of people who needed to find where loyalty was safest. She ignored all of it and kept working. On the second morning, 2 of Damien's assistants appeared in the staff hallway with an appointment for her at a stylist's address in Midtown. She attended. She sat in the chair while a woman named Petra with very precise eyeliner held up gowns in succession, a blush satin, a gold sequined column, a deep red thing with a thigh slit that Petra described with visible enthusiasm as the statement option. Elena looked at each one and said nothing for a long moment after each presentation. Petra's enthusiasm began to dim by the 4th dress. "These are all very beautiful," Elena said finally, in the tone of someone who meant the opposite. Mr. Varelli's office indicated a preference for— Mr. Varelli's office indicated a budget, Elena said. Not a preference. She moved to the rack herself, pushing hangers aside with careful deliberation. What she needed was something that didn't announce itself, something that didn't try. She found it near the vac. Black, structural, with a neckline that was severe rather than revealing. A silhouette with the clean geometry of something designed to be worn by someone who didn't need a dress to make the argument for her. She held it out. Petra studied it with the expression of someone revising an assumption. "That's not what I was told to—" "It's what I'm wearing," Elena said quietly, and the conversation ended there. She stood in front of the mirror in the staff bathroom on the evening of the gala and assessed the result the way she might assess a problem. Not with vanity, but with calculation. The dress worked. The pendant worked, her grandmother's, a diamond set piece her father had hidden away for her before the estate was seized, the last physical remnant of who she'd actually been. She'd carried it sewn into the lining of her travel bag for 5 years. She'd debated whether to wear it tonight. The debate had taken less than 30 seconds. She needed people in that room to see her clearly. She needed the pendant to be visible, because she had a theory about what tonight would bring, and the theory required a provocation. She pulled her hair back into something that was severe in exactly the right direction and left the bathroom. The staircase descent was something she hadn't planned to make significant, but the silence that fell over the entrance hall as she came down, it made significance unavoidable. 3 of the household staff were present: Mrs. Dalton, Rourke, a young man named Fielding who handled logistics and whose primary mode of communication was a clipboard he appeared to use as a shield. All 3 of them were looking at her with different iterations of the same expression. She didn't slow down on the stairs. She kept her pace even. Damien was standing near the front door in a black dinner jacket with his arms crossed, talking to a man she didn't recognize, and he turned when the silence registered. His eyes moved up the stairs and found her, and there was a moment, brief enough that she might have imagined it, but she didn't imagine things, where something shifted in his face. Not attraction, not quite. Something more unsettled than that. The expression of a man who had made a calculation and was now discovering the calculation was incomplete. The man beside him said something she couldn't hear, low enough to be private. Damien didn't respond to it. "You're on time," he said when she reached the bottom. "I'm always on time," she said. He looked at her for another moment, something working behind his eyes, and then he moved toward the door. She fell into step beside him. Not behind, not quite beside in the deferential configuration of a date being escorted, but alongside, as if they were walking the same direction and had simply ended up level. She saw the slight tension in his jaw when he registered it. She didn't adjust. The Black Veil Gala was held that year at a venue called the Ashworth Club, a converted Gilded Age private dining society on the western edge of Midtown. The kind of building that had been renovated enough times to look merely old rather than genuinely historic. Its original bones buried under successive layers of acquisition and reinvention. The kind of building, in other words, that mirrored the people who used it. The car ride had been almost entirely silent. Damien had looked out the window. She had looked forward. The silence had not been comfortable, but it had been controlled, which was what she needed. What she had not been prepared for, not intellectually, because she'd known what this room would be, but physically, in the way your body knows things before your reasoning catches up, was the specific weight of walking into that event. She had been here before. Not to this building, but to this kind of room. She'd spent the first 17 years of her life inside rooms like this, at her father's elbow, at her mother's side, learning the grammar of power in real time. She had been to Black Veil as a child, once, at 15, with her father. She remembered the way the light had looked. Too warm, engineered, designed to make everyone in it appear more significant than they were. She remembered the sound, the specific acoustic density of a room in which everyone was listening and no one was being honest. She had not been back since everything ended. The entrance drew reactions she'd been expecting, and some she hadn't. Damien drew the room's attention first. He always would, in any space, by virtue of both who he was and the specific quality of his disregard for the attention. Then, sequentially, the attention moved to her, and she watched it move. The first wave was amusement. She caught the looks passing between people. The slight widening of eyes, the small smiles, the deliberate absence of discretion in the glances that followed their progress across the room. A maid. He'd actually done it. She could read it in the postures of people she hadn't met yet, in the angle of turned heads. Then she caught the second wave begin, slower, less sure of itself, because she was not behaving like someone who'd been brought as a joke. She was moving through the room the way she'd always moved through rooms like this, which was to say, as if she had every right to take up space in them. The first conversation came from a man named Hargrove. She knew the name from research, a hedge fund figure with laundered connections to 3 of the families she'd spent years tracking. He approached within the first 15 minutes, with the specifically calibrated confidence of a man who intended to establish hierarchy through condescension. "Virelli," he said, barely looking at her. "Brave choice." Hargrove, Damien said. The syllables were flat. Hargrove let his eyes move to Elena with the deliberateness of a decision. And you are? Elena, she said. She did not offer more. She met his gaze and held it at exactly the level of someone who expected to be addressed with basic courtesy, which in this room was itself an act of aggression. Something registered in Hargrove's expression. Recalibration. Very brief. First time at the Black Veil? No, she said. He blinked. I don't recall seeing you here before. That doesn't surprise me, she said pleasantly. The pleasantness was a knife with a very particular edge. You seem like someone who doesn't see a great deal of what's in front of him. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. Hargrove's expression did several things in rapid succession. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Damien turn to look at her. Hargrove recovered with the efficiency of a man who'd survived worse. He said something vaguely diplomatic and moved on, and the space he left behind him was a different shape than the space he'd occupied before the conversation. Damien leaned slightly toward her, close enough that she could hear him below the ambient noise of the room. What exactly are you doing? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Talking to people at a party, she said. Sir. The pause was significant. He didn't respond, but he didn't step away from her either. The next 2 hours moved like water finding the lowest point in a room, inexorably, quietly, in directions that weren't immediately visible until the damage was already done. She moved through conversations with the specific fluency of someone who had once been fluent in this world and never entirely lost the syntax, even when the vocabulary became someone else's. She spoke Italian with 2 of the men whose names she recognized from the financial networks surrounding the Veil collapse. She discussed structural investment policy with a woman who chaired 3 corporate boards and who spent the first 5 minutes of their exchange visibly deciding how seriously to take her, and then spent the next 15 taking her more seriously than she'd clearly intended. She navigated a conversation with a city official whose role in the machine that had destroyed her family was indirect but real, and she did it without showing a single edge of what she knew, which was the hardest part. Not the intelligence, not the memory, but the patience to be near someone responsible for your destruction and smile at them like a stranger. Through all of it, she felt Damien watching. She didn't look back at him directly, but her peripheral vision was sharp and she'd always had an acute spatial awareness of where people were in rooms. He had stopped performing indifference about 20 minutes in, which was faster than she'd expected. By the end of the first hour, he had stopped pretending to be engaged in his own conversations. He was watching her work the room. She could feel him recalibrating. She was near the East Bar when it happened. She was waiting for a glass of water. She'd refused alcohol for the evening, a decision she'd made before leaving the house, because she needed everything sharp tonight, and she became aware of a presence settling beside her. Not aggressive, not immediate, the kind of presence that had weight before it spoke. She turned. He was old. 70s, probably, the kind of old that comes with excellent tailoring and the particular stillness of a man who'd learned decades ago that his physical stillness communicated more than most men's movement. Silver-haired, the face of someone who had once been handsome and now occupied a different category entirely, the category of faces that had accumulated too much history to be assessed on their structure alone. He was looking at her pendant. Specifically, he was looking at it the way you look at something that shouldn't exist. She watched his expression move from recognition to something much older than surprise. Where did you get that? His voice had dropped to something barely above the ambient sound of the room, and what was in it was not a question. It was something closer to a confession trying to stop itself. Elena met his eyes. She did not move. She did not adjust. She let the moment exist exactly as it was. The old man's hand moved toward his collar, stopped. His jaw worked once, like a mechanism resetting. His eyes came up from the pendant to her face, and she watched him do the thing she'd been waiting 8 months, no, 5 years, for someone in this room to do. She watched him see her. Not the maid, not the prop, not the punchline. He saw her face, and he did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic told him something that drained the color from his expression in real time. "You're a Veil," he whispered. The word didn't travel far. The noise of the room swallowed most of it. but the radius of silence that immediately formed around him made it carry. 3 people nearby turned, then 5. Then the turning became contagious, the particular social reflex of a room in which people have learned to read the reactions of others for early warning. The old man had taken 1 step backward, and his hand was shaking. "You're a Vale," he said again, slightly louder, and this time the words landed differently. Not just a recognition, but an alarm, and the alarm moved through the room's power structure, the way electricity moves through water. She felt the temperature change before she understood all the reasons for it. She felt, behind and to her left, Damien Varelli go very still, and she thought, "Here we go." In the same breath as she thought, "Be ready." Because the old man's face had just cycled past recognition and past alarm into something rawer and more revealing than either, into the specific expression of a man who thought he was looking at a ghost, which meant he had believed she was dead, which meant he had been one of the people responsible for making sure of it. The room was beginning to fracture around her, and she was standing in the center of it with her water glass untouched and her pendant catching the light of 1,000 engineered bulbs. And the name she'd buried 5 years ago had just been spoken aloud in the one room in the city where it could do the most damage. She held herself very still, the way she'd learned to hold herself when everything was about to move. She did not yet know that somewhere in Damien Varelli's expression, behind the cold calculation she'd watched him use like a tool all evening, something had cracked open that he would spend the rest of the night trying to close again. She would find that out soon enough. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, before the room made its first move. She used 3 of them to breathe. The old man's name was Castellan. She knew that before he'd said a word to her. Renard Castellan, 73, former silent partner in a financial holding company that had dissolved its assets 18 months after the Vale collapse, dissolved them in exactly the way assets were dissolved when they needed to stop being traceable. She had his name on a piece of paper in the false panel in her wardrobe. She had his initials on a partial ledger entry she'd spent 4 months confirming. She had not expected to be standing 3 feet from him at a bar when everything broke open. He took another step back and his shoulder caught the edge of the bar, and he steadied himself against it with the mechanical instinct of a man whose body was compensating for what his mind was still trying to refuse. His eyes hadn't left her face. They had the quality of eyes that were doing arithmetic against their will. "You need to lower your voice," Elena said quietly. "You're supposed to be—" He stopped himself. The stop was involuntary, and it told her everything she needed about what he'd been about to say. "Dead?" she said, even quieter than before. His jaw closed. His throat moved. Around them, the radius of silence had grown to encompass maybe 8 or 9 people now, those closest to the bar, and beyond them the ripple was still moving outward through the crowd in the specific way that alarm moves through a room full of people who have learned to be afraid of alarm. "I don't know what you think you're—" "I'm not thinking anything," she said. "I'm standing at a bar. You approached me." He looked at the pendant again. His hands were at his sides, and the right one was trembling slightly, the fine motor tremor of a man whose nervous system had just received information it hadn't been designed to process. "That piece," he said. His voice had gone rough. "That belonged to Miriam Vale." "Yes," Elena said. "It belonged to my grandmother." The silence around them had weight now. She felt rather than heard Damien arrive at her left shoulder, not close enough to be beside her, but close enough that his presence registered in her peripheral vision, and she felt the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of someone waiting to see what happened. It was the stillness of someone doing very fast calculations. Castellan's eyes moved to Damien, and then back to her, and something moved across his face that was older and more frightened than the social performance he'd been maintaining. "Varelli," he said. The name was directed at Damien, but his eyes stayed on her. "Castellan," Damien said, flat, careful. "Do you know who this woman is?" The question had the shape of an accusation inside it. Damien's pause was 3 seconds long. She counted them without moving. "She's my guest," he said. "She is a Vale," Castellan said, and this time the name carried enough volume that the ripple in the room became a current. She watched it move, heads turning, the sequential recognition of a room full of people who heard a word they hadn't been expecting and understood immediately what it meant, which told her everything about how present the fear of that name still was in this space, even after 5 years, even after everything they'd done to erase it. The woman with the 3 corporate boards had gone very still, 12 feet to Elena's right. The city official she'd been navigating earlier had turned from his conversation and was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the specific calculation of a man deciding how quickly he could create distance. Hargrove had appeared at the edge of the forming circle, and his face had a quality she hadn't seen during their earlier exchange. Something stripped of its social processing, something raw and instinctive and not entirely in his control. The room was deciding what to do with her. She had known it would do this. She had factored it into the plan. What she had not factored, what she had genuinely not allowed for in her calculations, was the scale of the reaction. The visceral, immediate animal quality of the fear she'd provoked simply by standing in this room wearing her grandmother's jewelry and refusing to look away from an old man who had helped kill her father. She had known they were afraid of the Vale name. She had not understood, not in her bones, how afraid. "You should leave," Castellan said. He was speaking to her, but looking at Damien. "You need to get her out of this room." "Why?" Damien said. The question was simple, almost innocent in its delivery. But she could hear the thing underneath it, the thing that had shifted in Damien's voice over the past 2 hours. The incremental adjustment of a man who had come here tonight with a clear sense of what he was doing and was now standing in a situation that had moved past his understanding of it. "Because—" Castellan stopped again. He pressed his mouth shut. His eyes went around the room in a quick professional sweep that had nothing casual about it. "Because these people are not going to react well," he said quietly. And now the fear in his voice had changed registers, had moved from the fear of recognition into something more immediate and operational. "And you don't understand what you've walked into." "Tell me," Elena said. He looked at her. "Tell me what I've walked into," she said. "Tell me what my father walked into 14 years ago, when he came to rooms like this and trusted the people in them." Castellan's expression did something complicated and then closed down entirely, the shuddering of a man who had decided that the available options were bad, and silence was the least bad of them. "Get her out," he said to Damien. "Now, chat." Damien's hand closed around her upper arm, and she let him move her because the direction he was moving was away from Castellan and toward the edge of the crowd, which was where she needed to be anyway for what came next. She didn't pull against his grip. She walked beside him with the controlled pace of someone who was choosing to go where they were going. They cleared the immediate crowd and moved along the periphery of the room toward the far corridor that led to the building's service areas and secondary exits. She knew the layout. She'd obtained the floor plan 6 weeks ago, had spent 40 minutes memorizing it in the staff bathroom with the door locked. "Talk," Damien said when they were clear of the worst of the crowd density. "Not here." "Then tell me where." She glanced behind them. 3 of the men she'd clocked earlier in the evening, not guests, not quite, they had the posture and the placement of people present in a professional capacity that wasn't social, had begun moving in the same general direction, with the unhurried certainty of people who knew the room's geometry and were using it. "Faster," she said. Damien followed her eyeline, clocked the same 3 men, and his grip on her arm shifted from directive to something more functional. He moved them through a door and into the corridor behind the main room without looking like he was moving them through a door, which took a particular kind of physical intelligence, she noted, without having time to examine. The corridor was narrow and lit with service fluorescence, the kind of light that stripped everything down to its essential ugliness. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear his. "Start talking," he said. I need 5 minutes in a room that locks." "You need to tell me right now what just happened in there." She stopped walking. He was still holding her arm, and the corridor was too narrow for comfortable distance, so they were closer than they'd been all evening, closer than she'd planned for, which was its own specific problem. She could see the thing in his face that the fluorescent light made impossible to misread. Not anger yet, not quite, but the thing that preceded anger in men who were accustomed to controlling their environments, the specific frustration of someone whose model of a situation has just been proven wrong. "My name isn't just Elena," she said. He waited. "My father was Harlan Vale." Something moved through his expression too fast for her to catalog entirely. Recognition. immediate and involuntary. Everyone in New York who ran in these circles knew the Vale name, knew the collapse, knew the public version of the story, the spectacular unraveling of a financial dynasty, the founder dead of a heart attack at 61, the assets seized, the daughter vanished. It was the kind of story that got told at dinners like the one he hosted on Thursday evenings, deployed as a cautionary tale or as a reference point, or sometimes just as the particular entertainment of people who found other people's ruin interesting. She watched him know all of that, and she watched him do the next calculation, the one that connected what she'd just told him to the 8 months she'd spent in his house. "You came to me intentionally," he said. "Yes." "You got yourself hired." "Yes." His jaw tightened. The hand on her arm didn't let go, but the grip changed again. Not harder, but more deliberate, the grip of someone deciding something. "Why?" "Because your father has something I need." The silence in the corridor was total, except for their breathing and the muffled sound of the event on the other side of the wall. "My father," Damien said, "Leon Varelli, 40% partner in the consortium that acquired Vale Holdings assets in the liquidation. Signatory on 3 of the documents that—" "I know what my father's business is." "Then you know he has financial records," she said, "from the acquisition, records that show the liquidation wasn't organic, that the insolvency was manufactured, that specific accounts were accessed before the public filing, that—" "Stop!" He said it quietly, but with an edge that cut cleanly. "Stop right there." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that had moved past the frustration and into something colder and more complicated. She held his gaze. She owed him that much, not looking away from what he was working through, even though looking at it directly was not comfortable. "You've been in my house," he said slowly. 8 months. In my house, going through— "What exactly?" "Documents. When I had access, which wasn't often." "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Not yet." "Not yet." He repeated it in a tone that suggested the words had a particular flavor. "So you haven't— you still need—" He stopped, restarted. "And tonight, the pendant. That wasn't an accident." "No." "You wanted to be recognized." "I wanted to see who recognized me," she said, "and how they reacted, and what Castellan would do when he saw me standing in that room alive." He let go of her arm. He took 2 steps back, and she watched him run one hand across his face, a gesture she'd never seen from him before, unguarded in a way nothing else she'd observed in 8 months had been. The gesture of a man allowing himself 3 seconds of actual human response before he locked it back down. "Castellan," he said the name. "You knew he'd be here. He attends every year. And you know what he is." "I know what he did," she said, "which isn't the same thing, but it's close enough." He turned away from her and looked at the corridor wall for a moment, and she used that moment to track her own breathing. It was faster than she wanted it to be, faster than she could afford for it to be, because whatever happened in the next 5 minutes needed her to be sharper than she'd been all evening. "My father," he said to the wall. "You're saying my father was directly involved in what happened to your family. I'm saying he was one of several principals in a coordinated financial action that destroyed a man who wouldn't cooperate with a syndicate he'd been trying to exit. I'm saying that action killed him, and I'm saying your father has documents in a private vault that prove it." He turned back. His face was the face she'd spent 8 months reading across the margins of rooms, the face of a man who maintained control as a physical practice rather than an emotional one. But there was something in it now that she'd never seen there before. Something that was trying to organize itself and couldn't quite. "You used me," he said. "You invited me to that gala to humiliate me," she said, "in front of the same people who helped kill my father. So let's be careful about who used whom tonight." The silence that followed that had real texture. She felt it against her skin. Then, from the other side of the wall, came a sound that reordered everything. Not loud. A single compressed crack that most people in that room would have processed as something dropped, something structural, a misfire in the building's old pipes. She processed it correctly because she had been listening for the specific register of it for years, in the way you listen for things you were afraid of. A second crack followed immediately, and this time the sound that came with it from behind the wall was not ambiguous. It was the specific acoustic signature of a room full of people discovering that something dangerous was happening among them. Damien moved first. He grabbed her arm again, and she was already moving before he made contact, already calculating the corridor geometry and the exit positions she'd memorized 6 weeks ago. "There's a service exit at the end of this corridor," she said. "Left at the junction, then 40 feet to a stairwell." "How do you know that?" "Does it matter right now?" He didn't answer. They moved. The stairwell was where she'd expected it to be. They took it down rather than up. Ground level was the wrong choice if whoever had deployed those 2 shots was working the building, and she had to assume they were working the building, because in her experience, these kinds of operations were not improvised. They had been planned by someone, which meant they had been planned before tonight, which meant tonight had been anticipated by people who knew what she was going to do before she did it, or who had prepared for the possibility of it. The sub-level corridor smelled like old stone and heating oil, emergency lighting. The sound of the event above them had become a continuous low noise, the sound of a crowd that didn't know what was happening but understood that something was wrong. Damien was on his phone. She heard him say 2 words and then disconnect. Short, directive, the communication of a man whose people knew how to receive incomplete information and act on it. "I have a car coming to the service entrance on the north side," he said. 2 minutes. "How many of your people know this building?" He looked at her sideways. 4. "Are you sure about all 4? The pause before he answered was 1 second too long. 3, he said. "I'm sure about 3. She filed that and kept moving. The service entrance was a steel door with a push bar, and beyond it was a ramp that sloped up to street level where the cold hit them immediately. The particular cold of Manhattan in winter, sharp and wet, the kind that found the gaps in clothing before your body had time to brace. She could hear traffic. She could hear, from somewhere above and behind them, the sound of the building reacting to whatever was happening inside it. The car was there. Black, nondescript, engine running. The driver was a man she didn't know, which was a problem she categorized and put aside because Damien was already moving toward it, and the alternative to the car was the open street and heels with unknown operatives somewhere above them. She got in. The car moved before the door was fully closed. Damien was beside her in the back seat, and the particular quality of silence between them now was nothing like the silence in the car on the way to the Gala. That had been controlled. This was pressurized. She could feel him containing something. Not anger, not quite, but the thing that built in people when they discovered that the shape of their life was different than they'd believed it was. When the version they'd been operating from turned out to be missing significant structural information. She understood that feeling from a specific direction. She'd been living with it for 5 years. He said nothing for 3 blocks. Then, "The shooting, that was connected to you." "Almost certainly," she said. "Someone in that room made a call." "Castellan," she said, "or someone Castellan communicated with when he saw me. The people who came here tonight to this city, to that event, they have operational resources. This isn't..." She paused, choosing the word carefully. "This isn't random. They've been maintaining readiness for exactly this kind of exposure for years. Someone who knew my father, who was part of what happened to him, who has spent years believing the threat was neutralized. Tonight I proved it wasn't. By wearing a necklace. By existing," she said. "The necklace was just to accelerate it." He turned to look at her directly, and the light from the street moved across his face in intervals. "You went in there tonight knowing this could happen." "I went in there tonight because it was the first access I'd had in 5 years to the people responsible. I needed them to react. I needed to see how they reacted and who reacted and in what order. You needed to flush them out," he said. "You used my invitation to put yourself in front of a room full of people who want you dead, and you used the reaction to map the network." She looked back at him. "Yes. While you were also in my house," he said, "under false credentials, looking for evidence against my father." "Yes." The car took a corner and the city outside shifted. She became aware of something. A vehicle, mid-sized, maintaining a consistent position 2 cars back. She tracked it in the side mirror without moving her head. "We're being followed," she said. Damien said 3 words to the driver without raising his voice, and the car's behavior changed immediately. A left turn that wasn't the expected route, then another, the kind of driving that was testing rather than evading. The vehicle behind them adjusted. 2 cars back, she said. Dark blue. It adjusted. He'd already seen it. She could tell from the set of his shoulders. How many do you think? From the event? At least 2 teams. Castellan wouldn't use one. She was calculating. They'll have the building exits covered. They would have moved fast once the shooting started. The shooting was probably a signal as much as an attempt. Disrupt the room, extract targets, or drive them into prepared positions outside. You're very calm, Damien said, and what was in his voice when he said it was not a compliment and not exactly an accusation. Something in between. The observation of a man reconfiguring his understanding of who was sitting next to him. She was not calm. Her heart rate was elevated and her hands, folded in her lap, were taking real effort to keep from showing it. But she had discovered in the past 5 years that calm was not a feeling. It was a practice. You performed it until it became functional. Your father's vault, she said. The records I came to find. Where are they? He stared at her. Damien. She used his name for the first time. It was deliberate. Where does your father keep the financial records from the Vale acquisition? You're asking me to... I'm asking you where they are. I don't know where, He stopped. Something moved across his face. There's a property, he said slowly. In Connecticut. Old building. He uses it as a secondary office. There are archives there, physical files, pre-digital. He's... Another stop. He's never let anyone access them. Not me, not his attorneys. He has one person who manages that property, and the key doesn't leave the building. How far is the Connecticut property from where we are right now? He looked at her for a long moment. The vehicle 2 cars back was still there. The driver took another unscheduled turn, and it followed. 2 hours, Damien said. Then we need to decide something in the next 30 seconds, she said. Because the people behind us are going to close that distance before we clear the bridge, and whatever direction we choose after that, we are not coming back from it. I need you to understand that. I've been preparing for this for 5 years. You had, she glanced at her watch, about 40 minutes. So I need you to decide right now, while we still have options, which side you're on. He held her gaze. Outside the window, New York moved past in its indifferent winter blur, all glass and light and cold, the city doing what it always did, which was continue without caring what happened inside the cars moving through it. The vehicle behind them closed half a car length. My father ordered the deaths of your family, Damien said. It wasn't a question. He was hearing it for the first time in a form he couldn't deflect. Yes, she said, and I've been running his money for 12 years without knowing it. She said nothing. She let him hear it. His jaw tightened. She watched something in him make a decision, not about her, or not only about her, about something older and heavier that had been sitting in the architecture of his life without a name attached to it, the specific weight of inherited things that don't bear examination. He leaned forward and said 4 words to the driver. The car accelerated. Behind them, the dark blue vehicle did the same, and the gap between them closed to 1 car length, and then the driver took an entrance ramp at a speed that made her brace against the door, and the city fell away behind them and the highway opened up ahead in the dark. And the highway was wet and the headlights behind them were closing, and the driver was a man named Colt, who Damien trusted with the particular trust of someone who had tested a person under conditions that made trust mean something real. Colt drove without being told how to drive, which was its own form of intelligence. Elena had turned in the seat to watch the pursuing vehicle through the rear window, and what she was doing was not panicking. Panic was a luxury she'd burned through at 19, standing in a lawyer's office being told that everything her father had built was gone, that the debt was real, that the investigation was closed, that the cardiac arrest had been confirmed and the case was not being reopened. She had used up her available panic in that office, and what had grown back in its place was something more durable and considerably less forgiving. The vehicle behind them was pushing the gap down to 3 car lengths. 2. She could see 2 occupants in the front seat and couldn't see the back. How many can Colt handle? She said. Depends on what they have, Damien said. Assume professional. Then we don't want to handle them on open road. He was watching the mirror on his side. There's a service plaza 40 miles east, Colt. I know it, Colt said. We don't stop, Elena said. A stationary position with one exit is exactly what they want. We're not stopping, Damien said. We're switching. She looked at him. There's a vehicle contact I can have at that plaza in 25 minutes. Different plates, different profile. We transfer and they follow the wrong car. He was already on his phone, already composing the call in his head before his thumb hit the screen. It's not clean, but it buys us the Connecticut road. She turned back to the rear window. The headlights held their distance now. Whoever was driving had settled into maintenance mode, not closing further, just holding, tracking rather than catching, which meant they weren't trying to intercept on the highway. They were following to a destination, which meant they thought they knew where the destination was. She felt the first real cold thing move through her chest since the corridor at the Ashworth Club. They're not following us, she said. They already know where we're going. Damien's thumb stopped on the phone. He looked at her. If they wanted to run us down, they'd have closed by now, she said. We're on open highway. They have the vehicle and presumably the resources. They're holding back because someone already told them the Connecticut property. They're not following. They're escorting. The silence in the car was different after that. Colt said without inflection, What do you want to do? Damien's jaw moved. She could see it in the mirror. The particular set of a man doing the mathematics of a situation that had just changed shape on him. Who knew about Connecticut? He said. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed inward, at a list he was running. How many people know that property exists? She said. 4, myself, my attorney, my father's property manager, and... He stopped. And who? He didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was its own answer. Damien. Marcus, he said. My operations director. Is Marcus one of the 3 you're sure about? Another pause. 1 second. 2. He was, Damien said. Colt took an exit she hadn't anticipated. Not the service plaza, not the Connecticut road, but a state route heading north that fed into a secondary network of roads she didn't have memorized. She recalibrated. The pursuing vehicle took the exit too, without hesitation, confirming what she'd already concluded. They turned off the main state route onto a county road, and the headlights followed at the same distance. A farm road after that, and the headlights were still there, patient and constant as a second shadow. Colt turned into an unpaved access road and cut the lights. They sat in the dark for 40 seconds. She listened to her own heartbeat. She listened to Damien's breathing, which was controlled but audible, the breathing of a man who had not been in this specific configuration before. Not the danger, she suspected he'd been in danger before, but the specific combination of danger and betrayal and the creeping knowledge that the architecture of his professional life had a room in it he hadn't known existed. The county road was visible from their position through the bare tree line. The following vehicle passed it without slowing, continued north, disappeared. Colt waited another 30 seconds before he spoke. They'll double back in 4 minutes when they lose us, maybe 3. Then we need a different route, Damien said. I know a road, Colt said. It adds 40 minutes. Take it. They moved. The Connecticut property was not what she'd imagined, which was something she noted with the specific displeasure of a person who prided themselves on accurate imagination. She had constructed it from fragments. Damien's brief description, a property record she'd located in a county assessor's database 6 weeks ago, a satellite image that had been low resolution and taken in summer when the foliage concealed the structure. She'd imagined a converted farmhouse, something old but maintained, the kind of property wealthy men used as a working retreat when they wanted to feel agrarian without actually being inconvenienced. What they pulled up to at 11:43 on a Wednesday night was a stone building that had been built as something institutional. She couldn't immediately identify the original purpose, but the architecture had the specific blankness of a structure designed for function rather than habitation. 3 stories, narrow windows, the kind of building that retained cold, the way old buildings retained the memory of what they'd been used for. The property manager was named Aldous. He was 60 or thereabouts, compact, and he met them at the vehicle with the expression of a man who had been called at an unusual hour and understood that unusual hours in his employment meant nothing good. Damien spoke to him quietly. She stood back and let the conversation occur, using the time to scan the perimeter. Open ground, gravel drive, tree line approximately 80 meters to the north. One exterior light at the entrance. Whatever security existed was not visible, which meant either there wasn't much or it was embedded in the structure. Aldous looked at her twice during the conversation. The second look was longer than the first. She kept her face neutral. They went inside. The archive room was on the second floor, accessed through a corridor that smelled of limestone and old paper, the specific smell of documents that had been kept in a controlled environment for a long time. Aldous unlocked the door with a key that he kept on his person. She confirmed with her eyes that it was the only key he carried, which matched what Damien had told her in the car, and then he stood in the doorway as if deciding whether to enter. "Leave us," Damien said. Aldous left. The room was larger than she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling shelving on 3 walls, labeled in a filing system she didn't immediately recognize. Alphanumeric, not chronological, which meant retrieval required knowing what you were looking for before you looked. A table in the center with a lamp, a second door at the far end closed. She moved to the shelving and began reading labels. Damien stood inside the door and watched her. "Tell me what I'm looking for," he said. "Acquisition records, 2011 through 2012. Anything cross-referenced with Vale Holdings, Varelli Capital, or a consortium designation that might appear as NYCE or New York Capital Exchange." That was the shell structure they used. He moved to the opposite wall and began looking without further question. She noted that. In another context, she might have noted it differently. She found the 2011 section in 11 minutes. The files were dense. Physical documents in labeled folders, some of them multiple inches thick. She pulled 3 folders and carried them to the table and opened the first one under the lamp. The first 20 pages were what she'd expected. Acquisition documentation, legal language, the standard scaffold of a large asset transfer. She moved through it quickly, scanning for specific language she'd memorized from the partial ledger copies she'd made at the Varelli estate. She found the first anomaly on page 31. It was a transfer authorization dated 4 weeks before the public filing of insolvency by Vale Holdings. She stared at it. Her hands on the paper were steady. Inside her chest, something was happening that required active management. 4 weeks before the public filing. That meant the transfer had been authorized before the company was officially insolvent, which meant someone with access to Vale Holdings' internal accounts had moved assets before the collapse was public, which meant the collapse had been known in advance by the people authorizing the transfer, which meant the insolvency wasn't organic, which was what she'd believed for 5 years and had never been able to prove with a primary document. She had a primary document. She kept reading. The second anomaly was on page 44, a signatory she hadn't seen before in any of her research. Not her father's signature, not Leon Varelli's, but a third-party signatory with initials she recognized from a different context entirely. She went still. She looked at the initials for a long time. Then she turned to the next page. She was on the 4th folder when Damien said her name. The way he said it made her look up immediately. It had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not the cold control or the contained frustration, or even the stripped-down version of himself she'd been getting in the car. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been hit. He was standing at the second door at the far end of the room, which was open now. She hadn't heard it open. She'd been reading. She crossed the room and looked through the doorway. It was a smaller room. 1 shelf. 1 file box, open, on a second table. And on the table beside the file box, a manila folder that Damien was holding with both hands and not looking at her. He was looking at the documents inside it. "Damien." "Give me a second," he said. His voice had a texture she hadn't heard before, like something that was being compressed by weight from above. She waited. 8 seconds. 10. He held the folder out to her. She took it. The first document was a communication, formal, typed, dated 13 years ago. She read the header, read the signatory lines, read the body of it, and read it again, because the first time her comprehension had stalled somewhere in the middle and she needed to be certain. It was a proposal. Addressed to Leon Varelli from a name she didn't recognize in the first line. But in the second paragraph, the name that appeared as the subject of the proposal, as the target of what the document called a restructuring initiative, was not her father's name, it was her mother's. Her mother, who had died when Elena was 9, a car accident. Icy road, a bridge outside the city, a vehicle that had gone through the guardrail at 3 in the morning when her mother had been driving back from a business trip alone. The proposal was for the acquisition of a specific asset, a secondary holding company that her mother had incorporated in her own name, independent of Vale Holdings, before Elena was born. The proposal outlined a plan for pressuring the asset holder into divestment through a combination of financial and social leverage. The language was businesslike and euphemistic in the way that businesslike and euphemistic language was sometimes used when the thing being discussed wasn't. At the bottom of the proposal was a handwritten addendum. 2 lines. The asset holder presents ongoing resistance. Recommend escalation to permanent resolution. Authorization, LV. She read the 2 lines 3 times. The room was very quiet. She was aware of Damien beside her. She was aware of the paper in her hands. She was aware of the lamp in the outer room and the sound of her own breathing, which was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. Her mother had not died in an accident. She had known. She had allowed herself to know, in the way you allowed yourself to know things that could not be proven and therefore could not be used. She had known that the sequence of events around her mother's death had been wrong in ways she couldn't articulate at 9 years old, and had never been able to make into a usable shape afterward. She had filed it and set it aside because the mission, the thing she'd built the past 5 years around, was her father's death and her father's company and the document trail that connected those events to the men responsible. She had not allowed herself to add her mother to the mission because adding her mother to the mission would have made it too large to manage, would have made it something she couldn't hold the shape of without it destroying her ability to function. She was holding the shape of it now. Her hands on the paper were still steady, which she registered from a distance as a fact about herself that she didn't entirely understand. "Elena," Damien said. She looked up at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen from it in 8 months of observation. The architecture that he maintained, the cold, the distance, the particular quality of a man who had made himself into a system rather than a person, had cracked along lines she could see. Not broken, but cracked. Because he was holding the knowledge that his father had signed a document authorizing what had happened to her mother, and he was holding it in the same room as the woman whose mother it had been, and whatever Damien Varelli was underneath the empire he'd inherited, it was not someone who was finding this easy. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. Her voice came out flat. Not cold. Flat. The specific register of someone whose processing capacity is at maximum and the overflow is going somewhere internal. Your father built what you inherited on 2 bodies," she said. "Not 1. That's what these documents are telling us." She set the folder back on the table. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the wall and allowed herself exactly the amount of time it took to breathe in and breathe out twice to do whatever needed to be done with what she'd just learned. Then she picked the folder back up and walked to the outer room and began looking for something to carry documents in. "What are you doing?" Damien said behind her. "I need something to transport these." "Elena, stop for one. I need," she said, with a precision that cut the air between them cleanly, "to transport these documents to somewhere they cannot be destroyed. That is what I need to do right now. I can have a different response to this later. I don't have time for it now." She found a document case on the lower shelf and began loading folders into it. Her hands were still steady. She hated how steady they were. It felt like a lie her body was telling about how she was. "The people who were following us know about this property. We have however long it took them to lose us and double back and regroup, which is probably less time than we want. I need to copy or take the primary documents from both rooms, and I need to do it now." She was pulling the second file box from the shelf when she heard it. Not outside. Inside. Below them. The building's ground floor. A door, but not the front entrance they'd come through. A different door, which meant a different entry point, which meant either Aldous had let someone in or Aldous had not needed to. She and Damien looked at each other. She heard footsteps on the staircase. More than one person. She closed the document case and looked at the room. One entry through the outer door, no windows in the archive room. The smaller inner room had one narrow window she'd noted on entry. She did the geometry in approximately 2 seconds. The window in the back room, she said, low. We're on the second floor. There's a ledge. I saw it from outside. She hadn't been certain it was structurally viable, but she was certain now in the way you became certain about things when the alternative was standing in a room with no exits waiting for people you hadn't invited. Damien crossed to the archive room door and engaged the lock. Old mechanism, keyed, which meant it would slow rather than stop. He looked at Colt, who had appeared from the stairwell end of the corridor, apparently from nowhere, and whose face communicated the specific brevity of a man who understood timelines. 2, Colt said, meaning the staircase. Maybe 3. Window, Damien said. Colt moved without comment. Elena had the document case under her arm. She went through the inner door and crossed to the window and assessed it in 3 seconds. Old casement, painted shut, the ledge outside approximately 14 inches wide and 2.5 feet below the windowsill. The ground was 12 feet down and she couldn't see what was under the window in the dark. She hit the window frame with the heel of her hand. Painted shut moved to reluctant and then to open with the second hit. Cold air and darkness. From the outer room, the sound of the locked door receiving weight on the other side. She handed the document case to Colt and swung one leg over the windowsill and then the other and dropped to the ledge with the particular grace of someone who had climbed in and out of enough places in the past 5 years to have learned how to make her body quiet and efficient about it. She pressed her back to the stone. 14 inches. Enough. Colt came through next, then Damien. His jaw was tight, his movements were controlled, and he didn't look down. The outer room's door gave. She heard it from outside. The clean sound of a lock that had been bypassed rather than broken, which meant keys, which meant someone with access to this building beyond Aldous and Damien, which meant the 4th person who knew this property existed, the attorney. She cataloged it in the part of her mind that was still running the longer game even while the immediate game required full physical attention. She moved along the ledge toward the building's corner. The stone was rough and wet and cold through her dress, and her heels were inadequate for this in ways she was choosing to process later. She reached the corner and looked around it. A drain pipe, older, the brackets fixed to the stone at intervals she needed to test rather than trust. She tested the first bracket with her weight. It held. She descended. They were in the tree line 80 meters from the building when she allowed herself to stop and breathe and let her legs register what her legs had been doing for the past several minutes without adequate commentary from her nervous system. Damien was beside her. Colt was ahead, moving between trees with a flashlight he'd produced from somewhere and was using at ground level, pointed down. Her feet were bleeding. The ledge and the drain pipe had been unkind to the inappropriate footwear, and she was currently standing on dead leaves in the dark in torn stockings and the specific physical awareness of a body that had been pushed past its considered preferences. She sat down against a tree trunk and opened the document case and confirmed by feel and the thin ambient light that the folders were still organized the way she'd arranged them. They were. The folder with the proposal was still there. She closed the case. Damien crouched beside her without being asked. She hadn't invited the proximity, and she didn't reject it. There were things that were more important than her preferred spatial boundaries at 11:58 on a Wednesday night in a Connecticut forest. Colt has a contact 20 minutes from here, he said low. Second vehicle. We get to it and we're off this grid. Where does the contact take us? Somewhere my father doesn't have reach. He has reach in a lot of places. I know. His voice, close and quiet in the dark, carried something she hadn't heard from him before. Not warmth exactly, but the quality of a person who has made a decision about something and the decision has cost them, and the cost is present in how they sound. She looked at him. In the dark, she could see the shape of his face and the general quality of his expression, which was not the expression he wore at his Thursday dinners or in the corridor of his estate or at the Black Veil with an event full of people performing their power for each other. He looked like someone who had been disassembled and had not yet decided what the rebuilt version was going to be. She understood that from the inside. Your father's attorney, she said. That's how they had access to this building. He was quiet for a moment. Renner, he said. Yes, he'd have keys. He manages the property trust. He's been feeding information to your father's network. Probably. A pause. Probably for years. She thought about the structure of that. The way a man could build his professional life on the assumption that certain foundations were solid, and then discover in a single night that the foundations had been someone else's instrument the entire time. She thought about it, and then she set it aside because this was not the time for empathy, which was a tool she'd learned to use selectively. The documents I found, she said, before the shooting tonight, in your father's system. She paused. The third signatory on the acquisition authorization, the initials I didn't recognize. Damien waited. JV, she said. She watched him absorb it. Who is JV? She said. The silence in the dark forest lasted long enough that Colt's footsteps had moved further away, and the sounds around them were down to wind and her own breathing. James Virelli, Damien said finally. My brother. She had not known he had a brother. She had spent 8 months in his house, 5 years building a dossier on the network that destroyed her family, and she had not found a single reference to a sibling. Where is your brother? She said. Damien stood. He looked in the direction Colt had gone, and his face in the dark was not readable in the way she needed it to be readable. My brother has been dead for 8 years, he said. Car accident, rural road, no witnesses. The case was closed in 6 weeks. She felt the cold move through her that wasn't from the November air. What did your brother do? She said. Before he died. Damien turned back to her, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had just had the same thought she'd had, who had arrived at the same terrible geometric point where 2 lines of information intersected at a place neither of them had expected. He was a federal financial investigator, Damien said. He was building a case against my father, against the families. His voice stopped and restarted with visible effort. He told me once, 2 months before he died, that he had documentation that could take down every criminal structure in New York's financial sector. He said the evidence was somewhere safe. He said... Damien stopped. The look on his face now was the look of a man realizing that the thing he was about to say would change the shape of everything that had come before it. He said if anything happened to him, Damien continued, very quietly, to find a woman named Vale, Damien said. He said find her. He said she'd know what to do with what he'd built. The forest held them in silence for 3 full seconds. Elena's mind was doing something she hadn't asked it to do. Running backward through 8 months of proximity to this man, through 5 years of building a case she'd thought was about her father, through everything she'd cataloged and mapped and memorized, and finding in the architecture of all of it a shape she hadn't seen before, a room she hadn't known was there. James Virelli had been building a federal case. James Virelli had found her name. James Virelli had died on a rural road 8 years ago, with no witnesses and a closed case file. Her mother had died on a bridge outside the city 12 years before that. Her father had died of a cardiac arrest that she'd never believed. The Virelli family had been eating its own and eating hers for longer than she'd understood. And somewhere in the wreckage was a thread her father's killer's son was now telling her his brother had tried to hand her. The evidence your brother had, she said. Her voice was level with effort. He never told you where it was. No. Did he tell you what form it was in? Damien looked at her directly. He said it was embedded, his word, that the proof was embedded somewhere they'd never think to look for it. She thought about the USB drive in the false panel in her wardrobe at the Virelli estate, the drive she'd compiled herself over 8 months of careful access. She thought about how she'd gotten access to the Virelli estate in the first place, the employment agency, the contract rotation, the way she'd nudged herself into a permanent position. She'd constructed the pathway herself, or she'd thought she had. Damien, she said slowly, how did I get hired? He frowned. Contract rotation. Mrs. Dalton handles who approved the contract agency. His mouth closed. Who approved the specific agency that placed me, she said. Operations director reviews vendor contracts, he said. Marcus would have... He stopped. Marcus reports to me. Who did Marcus report to before you? The look on his face told her. James, he said. She stood up from the tree, Her feet registered the protest, and she filed it. "Your brother placed me," she said. "He didn't know what was going to happen to him. He found me. I don't know how. I don't know when. He may have been tracking me the same way I was tracking the network, and he built a pathway for me to get inside. He set up the access before he died, and then he died, and the pathway sat there for 8 years until I found it from the other direction." Damien was very still. "The evidence he built," she said. "It's in your house. It has to be. Somewhere I haven't found yet because I didn't know I was looking for something he left. I was looking for what your father kept." She picked up the document case. "We need to go back. The estate is the first place my father will—" "I know," she said. "We need to go anyway, by some." Colt's contact was a man who operated out of a gas station that was technically closed, and whose vehicle was a flatbed truck with a lockable cab that smelled of machine oil and old coffee, and was, Elena understood when she climbed into it, essentially invisible on any road in the state because it looked like it belonged everywhere and nowhere. They drove south. She sat between Colt and Damien in the cab, and the document case was on her lap, and her feet had stopped bleeding and started aching, which she understood was biological progress. Damien was on his phone in intervals, building a picture from whatever intelligence Colt's network could access, and what he assembled over the 2-hour drive south was not comfortable. The Ashworth Club had been evacuated. 2 people injured, neither critically. The shooting had been, as she'd suspected, a disruption rather than a targeted strike, designed to move people out of the building in controlled chaos and allow secondary teams to work the exterior. Castellan had left the event before the shooting, which confirmed the sequencing she'd theorized. 3 of Damien's Thursday dinner associates had been unreachable since 11 p.m. One of them was the city official she'd managed through conversation at the gala. Leon Varelli was not at his primary residence. His housekeeper had been asked to leave the premises at 9 p.m., which was 3 hours before the gala incident, which meant Leon had been moving before the gala even ended. He'd known what the gala would produce before it produced it. She sat with that and the document case in her lap and watched the highway and said nothing for a long time. "He knew," she said finally. Damien's phone was in his hand, screen dark. "Yes. He knew I was in the house. He would have found out eventually. 8 months is—" "No." She turned to look at him. "He knew from the beginning. He let me stay." She worked through it as she said it, the logic assembling itself from pieces she'd been holding separately. "I was useful to him. I was finding things, yes, but I was also— my presence was a provocation he could control. If the other families knew Avail was still alive and active, he could use that. He could manage the information, position himself as the one holding the threat and containment." She pressed her thumb against the edge of the document case. "Until I stopped being controllable." "Tonight," Damien said. "The gala wasn't my idea," she said. "You offered it." "He may have suggested it." She looked at him. "He and I spoke on Thursday," Damien said. Something in his voice had gone rough at the edges. "He mentioned the black veil, mentioned that I'd been going alone. He said—" He stopped, jaw working. "He said it might be good for my image to bring someone unexpected." The flatbed moved through the dark in silence. "He staged it," she said. "He pointed me at you," Damien said, and what was in his voice now was not cold calculation or contained professionalism. It was something older and raw, the specific register of a man discovering that the person who taught him how to be in the world has been using him as an instrument his entire life. "He knew I'd pick someone visible, someone that would cause a reaction. He used me to flush you into the open." And when Castellan reacted faster than he expected, he lost the thread. The shooting was a backup, blunt. Damien's hand on his knee was tight. "He doesn't like blunt. He likes it when he can't find his cleaner option," she said. The truck took the exit ramp for Manhattan. The Varelli estate at 3:40 in the morning was not the building she'd spent 8 months learning. It was the same structure, same marble, same chandeliers off and cold above the entrance hall, same smell of old money and fresh wax. But it was the building as it existed without its performance running, and a building without its performance was always something rawer and less certain than its daytime version. Colt had come in through the service entrance, which Elena knew better than the front door. He'd confirmed 2 staff present, overnight security, one man she recognized and one she didn't. The one she didn't she categorized as a problem they'd address if required. She went straight to the 3rd floor. Her room was the same. She registered this with the particular relief of someone who had learned not to take the sameness of rooms for granted. She pulled the wardrobe away from the wall and removed the false panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd accessed it 200 times. The drive was there. She held it in her palm. 8 months of what she'd found. Financial fragments, ledger copies, names, and somewhere inside it, if she was right, if the logic of the past 2 hours held, something else. Something that had been placed there before her, by a federal investigator who'd been building a case and had found her and hadn't had time. She went back to Damien. He was in his office on the 2nd floor, standing at his desk with the document case open and 3 folders spread across the surface, reading. He'd removed his jacket. His shirt was untucked, and there was a cut on the back of his right hand she'd noticed during the descent from the window ledge that he'd said nothing about. She put the drive on the desk. He looked at it.
"Do you have a system your father doesn't have access to?" she said. "Here? No." He straightened. "But I have an encrypted partition on an air-gapped machine I keep at a secondary address. If James hid anything in your files, that's where we read it." "How far?" 20 minutes. She picked the drive back up. Then The office door opened. Not Colt. The wrong direction, the main hallway, the public corridor. And the handle had moved without a knock, without the specific sound of someone who was uncertain about their reception. Leon Virelli was 68 and looked like someone who had spent 68 years practicing the specific stillness of a man who understood that the person who moved first in any room was usually the person who needed something. He was not tall, but he occupied space with the thoroughness of someone who had never once in his life been required to make himself smaller for another person's comfort. Gray suit. No tie. The face of a man who had been handsome once and was now primarily powerful, which was a different and more durable condition. He looked at Elena first, then at the documents on the desk, then at Damien. "I thought we'd have more time," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who was genuinely disappointed rather than alarmed, which was more frightening than alarm would have been. Damien didn't move. "How did you get in?" "I own the building, Damien." "I changed the master codes." "Yes." Marcus changed them back. Leon walked into the room with the ease of someone entering a space that belonged to him, which it did, legally if not in any other sense anymore. He stopped at the opposite side of the desk and looked at the folders there. "You've been to Connecticut. Sit down, Dad." Leon looked at his son with an expression that was almost paternal. "I'm not going to sit down." "Sit down," Damien said. His voice had dropped to the register she'd heard him use on Thursday evenings, the one that was quieter than a shout and carried further. "Right now." Leon studied him for a moment with the assessment of a man calibrating how much of this was theater. Then he pulled the chair from the other side of the desk and sat. Elena had moved to the wall. She had put herself between Leon and the door in a configuration that was not accidental, and Leon had noted it. She could see the register in his eyes when he looked at her, the quick professional assessment of her positioning, which told her that Leon Virelli had spent enough time in rooms with threat assessments to read them when they walked in. "You're shorter than your mother," he said to her. The words were designed to destabilize. She knew it and absorbed the knowledge and kept her face level. "You knew her." "I knew of her," he said. "I never met her personally." "You signed the document." A pause. "Which document?" "The one authorizing what you called the permanent resolution," she said. "The one about Margaret Vale." Leon looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't move in any of the obvious directions. Not guilt, not alarm. Something more considered than either. "You found the addendum," he said. "I was curious whether it still existed. Aldous was supposed to..." He stopped himself. Not out of guilt, out of the mild professional irritation of a man noting an administrative failure. "That was a long time ago." She felt Damien's breath change from across the desk, heard the specific quality of it. The inhale held a beat too long. "Say that again," Damien said.
Leon looked at his son. I said it was a long time ago. You're confirming it. I'm not denying it, Leon said, with the precision of a man who understood the difference. Damien picked up the folder from the desk. His hand was steady. She could see the effort it was taking for his hand to be steady. You killed her mother. I authorized a resolution to a business problem, Leon said. The woman was obstructing a significant acquisition. She had documentation of certain arrangements that would have been— She was a person, Damien said. Everyone is a person, Leon said, not unkindly. That doesn't make them untouchable. I was 9 years old, Elena said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. She recalibrated and kept it level. I was 9 years old when my mother drove off that bridge. Leon turned to look at her. The look was not cruel. That was the part that required the most management. It wasn't cruel, it was simply the look of a man who had organized the world into a structure that permitted certain decisions, and within that structure he was not performing villainy. He was being practical in the way he'd always been practical. You survived, he said. Your father survived another 8 years. By my calculation, I showed considerable restraint. The sound that came out of Damien was not a word. He came around the desk. Leon stood without hurry, and there was a man in the doorway now. The security guard she hadn't recognized, large, positioned with the stance of someone who'd been outside that door for longer than the conversation had been happening. And Colt appeared from the hallway behind him with the specific silent efficiency that had always made her grateful he was on the right side of this. The room changed shape in 1 second. The guard moved toward Colt. Colt was faster and more economical than the guard expected, and the collision between them was brief and loud, and ended with the guard against the doorframe and Colt in a position that made continuation inadvisable. Leon had not moved during this. He looked at the result with the mild assessment of a man revising a resource evaluation. Marcus, he said into the air. Nothing happened. He said it again, and again nothing happened, and for the first time something moved in Leon Varelli's face that wasn't performance. A small recalculation, a brief rereading of the available information. Marcus is not coming, Damien said. He was beside his father now, too close for the desk to be useful as a barrier. I spoke with Marcus an hour ago. He made a decision. What decision? The same one I made, Damien said. When I read what you signed. Leon looked at his son with the expression of a man looking at a structure he built, discovering a fault line. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing. The families are going to be the least of your problems, Elena said. She stepped forward from the wall, and she was holding the drive and the document case, and she looked at Leon Varelli across his son's desk in his son's office in the building he'd purchased with money that had come in part from the destruction of everyone she'd been made from. Because in approximately 4 hours, I'm going to be in a room with a federal prosecutor I've been in contact with for 6 months. And I'm going to give her everything in this case and everything on this drive and the documents from Connecticut, and your son is going to provide testimony about the operational structure of the Varelli Group's criminal arrangements. And the addendum with your initials on it is going to be Exhibit 1. Leon looked at her. Something in his face moved. Not afraid, not yet, but the specific expression of a man who is revising his certainty about the available futures. You've been building this for a long time, he said. Since I was 19, she said. Your father would have been proud. He said it without irony, which was somehow the worst version of it. She didn't respond. You won't make it to the prosecutor, Leon said. He said it the way you said a weather forecast. Not a threat, a meteorological observation. The people in this city who need these documents to not exist are not going to wait for morning. They're already— I know, she said. They've been following us since the Gala. They lost us twice. They won't lose us a third time. She looked at him steadily. So here's what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes. You're going to call Castellan. You're going to call whoever is coordinating the operational response tonight, and you're going to tell them it's over. Leon stared at her. You're going to stand down every team active tonight, she said, because the alternative is that Damien puts you in a room until morning, and we walk out of here with the documents, and we let the families find out, in whatever way they find out, that the evidence exists and that the Varelli patriarch is the reason it's in federal hands. And in my experience, she set the document case on the desk, People in your position last about 6 hours after their allies decide they're a liability. The silence in the room was pressurized. Leon looked at his son. Damien said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides, and the cut on his hand had opened again from the movement, and there was a thin line of blood across his knuckle, and he was looking at his father with the expression of a man who has finally reached the bottom of a very long fall and is now standing there, finding out what the bottom feels like. "You do this," Leon said to him. "To your own." "You taught me," Damien said, "that power was the only thing that was real. You said everything else, loyalty, family, history. Those were leverage tools. That's what you said. When I was 12 years old and asking why you didn't come to James's graduation, you said sentiment was a vulnerability and power was the only honest thing." His voice was low and even and completely without heat, which was colder than shouting. "I believed you. I built everything on it. I ran your machine for 12 years and I didn't ask the right questions because you taught me the right questions were weakness." He picked up the folder from the desk, the one with the addendum, the 2 handwritten lines, the initials. "James asked the right questions. You killed him for it. And she—" He didn't look at Elena, but she felt the angle of his attention. "She's been asking them for 5 years, and you let her stay in your house because you thought you could control it." Leon said nothing. "Call them off," Damien said. Leon looked at the folder, at the room, at his son's face with the assessment of a man doing a final calculation about available options and their costs. Then he reached into his jacket. "Slowly," Colt said from the doorway. Leon produced a phone. Old model, not the one he'd been carrying. A secondary device. She'd known he'd have one. He looked at the number already on the screen, and then he looked at Elena. "This doesn't end with the prosecutor," he said. "You understand that. The families, make the call," she said. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. She held it back and did not look away, and did not adjust, and did not perform anything she wasn't actually feeling, which was the cold, exhausted, furious clarity of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment for 5 years and is now standing inside it, finding out that it doesn't feel like she'd imagined. It feels like work, like the hardest work she's ever done, sustained across years, arriving now at a moment that requires her to hold herself together by the ligaments when everything wants to come apart. She held it. Leon dialed. He spoke 4 words into the phone. She didn't catch all of them. The phone was held close to his mouth and his voice was low. But she caught the last 2, which were "stand down," and the pause that followed them in which the person on the other end did not immediately respond, and then the call ended. He held the phone out to Colt, who took it. "You have 6 hours, Leon said to Elena. "Maybe less, before whoever I just called decides that my instruction is no longer the relevant one." "I know," she said. She picked up the document case. "That's enough." She was moving toward the door when she heard it. From outside the building, from the street, the specific sound she'd been dreading since the highway, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving without the deceleration of people who were looking for a parking space. Colt was at the window in 2 steps. "3 cars, he said. "North side. Coming fast." She looked at Damien. "They didn't wait for Castellan's call," he said. "Or Castellan didn't pass it," she said. Leon, still seated at the desk, said nothing, but what moved across his face in the half-second before he controlled. It was not surprise, and she cataloged that fact and what it meant in the part of her mind that was still doing the longer accounting. He'd made the call. He just hadn't made it to the right number. The building's front door received impact, not an entry, a test, someone checking the resistance of the lock. And then there was a sound from the east side of the building that was lower and more deliberate and came from the service entrance she'd used herself 3 hours ago to come in. They were covering the building, and she was standing in the middle of it with the documents and the drive, and the only man in this city whose testimony could corroborate them, and his father at the desk, who had just told the people outside exactly where they were. Damien was looking at her. His face was not asking for a plan. His face was the face of a man who had made his choices and was ready for what the choices cost, and was waiting to find out what that looked like. She looked at him. She looked at the drive in her hand. She looked at the document case. She thought about James Varelli on a rural road 8 years ago, with his evidence embedded somewhere safe and a name he'd found and a pathway he'd built in the specific hope that the pathway would get used. She thought about her father at 61. She thought about her mother on a bridge at 3 in the morning. Then she stopped thinking about any of it and began moving because the East Service entrance had just stopped testing and started giving. And the window for choosing was about to close, and on the other side of it was only the thing you did when there were no more choices left and what remained was just the service entrance gave on the second impact. She heard it from the second-floor corridor, the specific sound of a reinforced door losing the argument with something hydraulic, a sound she'd filed theoretically and was now receiving in the body, in the chest, in the soles of her torn feet on the marble floor. Colt was already moving down the east corridor toward the sound before it finished happening. Damien was behind her, and she was running the geometry of the building in her head the way she'd memorized it, the way she'd memorized everything she'd needed to survive in this place, and the geometry was not kind. 3 cars outside. East entrance compromised. Front door untested but covered. The west stairwell. The one the household staff used for laundry delivery, narrow, accessed through the linen storage room on the second floor. She'd noted it her 3rd week in the building and had never used it for anything except the understanding that it was there. West side, she said. Linen room. Damien didn't ask how she knew. She was already moving. The linen room was unlocked. She'd made sure of that 6 months ago, a small deliberate thing she'd done with a lock mechanism and a piece of tape on the bolt strike. One of a dozen small deliberate things she'd done over 8 months for mornings exactly like this one. The tape was still there. The bolt didn't catch. The door swung open onto the smell of clean cotton and old wood and the narrow stairwell beyond it that dropped to the kitchen level and from there to the cellar access that connected to the utility corridor that ran beneath the building's footprint to a drainage access point at the north side. She'd walked that corridor in the dark twice. Practice. There's a drainage access, she said. North side of the building. It opens to the service alley. How far from the alley to 40 feet to the street, maybe 50. They'll have the alley. Not all of it, she said. The access point is below street grade. They'll be watching the building exits, not the ground. They went down the stairwell in the dark, one hand each on the wall, moving at the speed that was faster than careful and slower than reckless. She could hear, above and behind them, the sound of the entry team moving through the east ground floor. Professional, controlled, not shouting, which was worse than shouting because it meant they were disciplined. And disciplined teams didn't make the mistakes that got you out of situations like this one. From somewhere above came Leon's voice. She couldn't make out words. He was talking to someone, not into a phone, in person, which meant someone was with him in the office, which meant the team had reached the second floor faster than she'd calculated. She stopped calculating Leon's timeline and focused on the cellar. The utility corridor was what it had always been. 4 feet wide, 6 feet of clearance, concrete walls with pipe fittings at shoulder height, and a floor that was wet from something she didn't examine. She moved through it with the document case against her chest and the drive in her jacket pocket, which she'd moved it to in the linen room with the specific thought that if she lost the case, she could not also lose the drive. Damien's breathing behind her was controlled but audible. Colt had not come with them into the linen room. She'd heard him at the east corridor, the specific sounds of a man buying time with his body, and she had not stopped and she had not looked back because looking back was not something she could afford, and Colt was not someone who would have wanted her to. The drainage access was a steel hatch, horizontal, recessed into the corridor ceiling at the north end. She found it by memory in the dark. Third fitting past the water main junction, 4 feet from the north wall. She hit it with her palm in the specific place where the mechanism was loose from years of disuse and felt it shift. Damien was beside her. He put both hands on the hatch and pushed, and the mechanism that had been corroded and reluctant both times she'd tested it in the past 6 months decided to cooperate now in the way that things sometimes cooperated when the stakes made you stronger than you'd been in practice. Cold air. The smell of city. Exhaust and wet concrete and winter. The hatch opened onto a concrete recess below street grade, exactly as she'd mapped it, and above the recess was the service alley running along the building's north face, and beyond the alley was the street. She went up first.
Her arms shook on the last pull. She hadn't eaten since that afternoon, and her body was presenting its invoice for everything she'd asked of it in the past 6 hours, and the invoice was detailed and not sympathetic. She got over the edge and pressed herself against the alley wall and looked both directions. West end of the alley. A man, positioned at the corner, looking toward the building's north face. His back was to her, 20 feet, east end open, the street visible. Traffic, sparse at 4 in the morning, but present. Damien came up behind her and she caught his arm without looking and put her mouth near his ear. West, one man, we go east. She felt him nod. They moved along the alley wall with the particular quality of movement that was not sneaking. Sneaking was too slow, too self-conscious, too likely to read as suspicious if observed, but was rather the movement of people who belonged somewhere adjacent to here and were simply in a hurry, which was its own form of camouflage, in a city where people were always in a hurry. The man at the west end shifted his weight. She tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. He was looking at the building, not the alley. They reached the east end and turned onto the street, and she allowed herself one breath of cold Manhattan air that tasted like exhaust and pavement and the specific relief of open space. Her phone was in her jacket with the drive. She'd had it there since Connecticut. She had one number in it she'd been waiting to call for 6 months, a number she hadn't dialed until she was certain, until she had enough to make the call irrevocable. She dialed it now. The federal prosecutor's name was Diane Marsh, and she answered on the third ring at 4:17 in the morning with the voice of someone who had been awake, which meant she'd been expecting contact, which meant the infrastructure Elena had spent 6 months quietly building around this call had held. Elena walked. She talked. She was as precise as she was capable of being in the current state of her body and her mind and the document case under her arm, and Marsh listened with the particular listening of a professional who was assembling as fast as Elena was delivering. Damien was beside her on the sidewalk. He had blood on his collar from something she hadn't seen happen, and he was walking with the stride of a man who had made a permanent decision and was now living in the first minutes of the life that came after it. She told Marsh about the documents, the acquisition authorization predating the Vail insolvency filing, the addendum with Leon Varelli's initials, the transfer records. She told her about James Varelli, federal investigator, deceased, 8 years, the embedded evidence she believed was on the drive she was carrying. She told her about Castellan, about the Gala, about the shooting. She told her where she was and where she was going, which was a location she and Marsh had designated 6 months ago in a contingency framework that Elena had constructed for exactly this kind of morning, a federal satellite office in Lower Manhattan, staffed for emergency intake. Outside the jurisdictional footprint of every person Leon Varelli had ever put in a room and made comfortable. Marsh said, "How long?" Elena looked at the street. 40 minutes, maybe less. I'll have people at the building entrance." The call ended. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking and said nothing for a full block. The city moved around her in its indifferent 4 a.m. configuration. A cab, a delivery truck, a woman walking a dog with the particular purposeful efficiency of someone who had a schedule regardless of what the rest of the world was doing. "Marsh," Damien said, not a question. "Yes." "You've had her in place for 6 months. 5.5. He was quiet for a moment. "You were ready to do this without the Connecticut documents." "I was building toward it," she said. "It would have taken longer. The Connecticut documents accelerate it significantly. And my testimony." She looked at him sideways. He was looking forward, at the street ahead of them. His jaw and the particular set she'd come to understand meant he was holding something in rather than letting it drive. "Your testimony makes it airtight," she said. "Without it, the documents are powerful, but arguable. Leon's attorneys are good. With your operational knowledge of the Varelli Group's structure, the documents become unambiguous. I'm testifying against my father." "Yes." He kept walking. She kept walking. The blocks moved under their feet. "James tried to do the same thing," he said, 8 years ago. "James didn't have me," she said. She said it without vanity, simply as a structural fact. "And he didn't have you. He was working alone from inside the machine. We're coming at it from both sides simultaneously."
Damien made a sound that might have been something other than what it was, under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, it was a man absorbing the specific weight of his brother's absence and what his brother had been trying to do, and the 8 years between the attempt and this morning. She let him absorb it. She didn't fill the space. They were 12 blocks from the federal building when she heard the car. Not the sound of traffic, the specific sound of a vehicle that was moving in relation to their movement rather than independently of it. She felt it before she consciously processed it, the animal awareness of parallel motion, and she didn't change her pace or look directly but shifted the angle of her head by 3 degrees. Dark sedan, matching their pace exactly. One occupant visible in the front. She said low, 11 o'clock. Dark sedan. Damien didn't look. I see it. They're not closing. No. They're waiting for us to stop, she said, or for backup to position ahead. She looked at the street ahead of them. Across street 4 blocks up with a 24-hour pharmacy on the corner, lit from inside. The kind of place that was public enough and staffed enough that a professional operation would hesitate to move on them directly. Pharmacy, she said, 4 blocks. We go inside and I call Marsh back for an escort. 4 blocks is enough time for them to close. If they close on the street, we make noise, she said. They don't want noise. They want clean. He didn't argue. They kept walking. The sedan kept pace. 2 blocks from the pharmacy, the sedan's passenger window came down. She tracked it in the building glass they were passing, the reflective surface of a darkened storefront giving her the angle, and she saw the arm that came out of the window, and she grabbed Damien's jacket and pulled him left into a doorway recess as the sound caught up to the motion. Not loud, suppressed, the muffled compression of a professional tool. The door frame above her head received something. She was on the ground, one knee, document case still in her arms. Damien was beside her, down, and his hand was on her shoulder with a grip that was not gentle and was not meant to be. Hit? He said. No. She checked anyway. Body inventory, the way she'd been taught to do it by a woman in a self-defense course in a community center in Queens when she was 21, and had understood that her life from that point forward was going to require this kind of accounting. Nothing. You? No. The sedan had stopped. She could hear the door opening. She stood. The document case was in her left arm, and with her right she pulled the door behind her. The building's entrance, a residential lobby, unlocked in the way New York residential lobbies were sometimes unlocked at 4 in the morning by residents who forgot or didn't care. She pulled it open, and they went through, and she let it close behind them. Lobby, mailboxes, an elevator, a stairwell. She went to the stairwell door and held it. From outside, the sound of someone testing the lobby door. Does this building have another exit? Damien said. Every New York building has another exit, she said. Find the super's door, ground floor near the utilities. He found it in 3 minutes. She stood at the stairwell door and listened to the lobby. The entry door opened once. She heard the lobby's air pressure change, and then footsteps, 2 sets, moving toward the elevator. Not the stairwell. She went to the super's door. The super's exit led onto a different side street, and from there they moved differently. Not walking in a straight line now, but using the city the way the city could be used at 4 in the morning, which was as a series of perpendicular angles that made sustained visual tracking difficult. She'd learned this not from any course or manual, but from 5 years of moving through places she didn't entirely belong, carrying things she couldn't afford to lose. They reached the federal building at 4:51. There were 2 people outside the entrance in civilian clothing that was very nearly convincing. And one of them looked at Elena with the specific recognition of someone who had been given a description and was now confirming it, and she allowed herself to be confirmed. Inside, the building was the institutional neutrality of federal spaces everywhere. Fluorescent, carpeted in gray, staffed at the security desk by a man who had her name on a list, and Damien's beside it, and processed them both without commentary. Marsh was waiting in a room on the 3rd floor. She was 40-something, slim, with the face of someone who had spent a career in rooms where people lied to her and had developed the specific patience of someone who knew how to wait for the moment when lying became too expensive to continue. She looked at Elena.
She looked at the document case. She said, "Let's see what you have." Sit. Elena opened the case on the conference table and laid out the folders in the order she'd organized them in the Connecticut archive room, and Marsh's team, 3 of them, present and quiet and efficient, began working through them with the particular focused silence of professionals receiving exactly what they'd been building toward. The drive went to a technician who took it without comment and left the room with it. Elena sat down for the first time since the Ashworth Club. She sat in a chair at the conference table, and her feet registered the fact of the chair with something close to grief, the body's specific protest against everything that had been asked of it, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at them and breathed. Damien sat across from her. He had accepted a cup of coffee from someone and was holding it without drinking it. There was still blood on his collar. The cut on his hand had dried into a dark line across his knuckle. Marsh came to stand at the end of the table. "The addendum document," she said to Elena. "You can confirm chain of custody from the archive location." "Yes." "Damien can confirm the location's ownership and access history." Marsh looked at Damien. "Mr. Varelli, I understand you've agreed to provide voluntary testimony." "Yes," Damien said. The word was clean and uncomplicated. "That testimony will include operational details of the Varelli Group's structure, transactions, and key relationships." "Yes." "You understand that this testimony will be used in federal proceedings against individuals including your father?" "Yes," Damien said again, with the same clean simplicity, and she understood that he had said it enough times on the walk here, internally, that the word had worn through to something that didn't require additional weight. Marsh held his gaze for a moment longer than procedural. Then she nodded once and made a note. The technician returned. He gave Marsh a tablet and spoke to her quietly. Marsh looked at the tablet, scrolled, looked again, and her expression did something Elena had not seen from her in 6 months of careful, cautious contact. It opened, briefly, controlled, but real. "The drive," Marsh said to Elena. "There's a partition on it you didn't create." Elena looked at her. "Encrypted file structure, different architecture from your files. It predates your data by approximately 8 years based on the metadata." Marsh set the tablet on the table where Elena could see it. "We'll need time to fully decrypt, but the preliminary read suggests it's a complete federal case file. Wiretap authorizations, financial forensics, witness statements." She paused. "It's signed by a federal investigator named James Varelli." The room was very quiet. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the partition label, the file dates, the architecture of something built by a man she'd never met, who had found her name and built a pathway and died on a rural road before he could use it, and had trusted she didn't know how. She would spend time later understanding how. He had trusted that someone would find the path and walk it to the end. She looked at Damien. He was looking at the tablet with his coffee cup still in both hands, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man receiving something he had lost and did not expect to find and cannot process in the present tense. So he holds very still and lets the future tense handle it when it arrives. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what was in the room. Bob. Leon Varelli was arrested at 6:48 in the morning at a secondary property in Westchester where he had gone after the Varelli estate, which told her he'd had a plan for that contingency, which meant he'd known the estate would be compromised, which meant the call he'd made had been the tell she'd read it as. The arrest was handled by a federal team operating on the warrant Marsh had had in preparation for 7 weeks, waiting for exactly the threshold of evidence that the Connecticut documents and James's drive cleared in combination. Castellan was taken at a hotel in Midtown at 7:15. The city official she'd navigated at the Black Veil Gala was arrested at his home in the early morning, still in his robe, which was reported later by someone who'd been there and had the specific satisfaction of a detail too human to be invented. She was in the federal building until noon. She gave her statement in full, chronologically, with the specific precision of someone who had been organizing this statement in her head for 5 years and knew where every piece of it went. Marsh's team asked questions and she answered them, and when the questions stopped, she sat in the chair and drank water and waited for the next set. Damien gave his testimony in a separate room. She didn't hear it and didn't ask to.
What he was saying in that room was between him and the people who needed to hear it, and the ghost of the brother who had tried to say it 8 years earlier with no one in the room to receive it. At 2 in the afternoon, Marsh came to find her where she was sitting in a hallway on a bench that was the kind of uncomfortable that was designed for waiting rather than resting. "The families are moving," Marsh said. She sat on the bench beside Elena with the directness of a woman who had earned the right to sit wherever she chose. "Lawyers are already mobilizing. It's going to be a long process." "I know," Elena said. "The Virelli Group's assets are being frozen pending investigation, the estate included." "I know." Marsh looked at her sideways. "You've been planning this for 5 years. How does it feel?" Elena thought about the question seriously, which it deserved. "It feels like the morning after something," she said. "Not the thing itself, the morning after." Marsh nodded slowly. She understood, Elena thought. The gap between the pursuit and the arrival, the specific absence that came after the thing you'd built yourself around, was no longer ahead of you, but behind you. And you were standing in the first morning of whatever came next without the architecture of the mission to organize yourself inside. "What will you do?" Marsh said. "Sleep," Elena said. "First." She stayed in a federal housing arrangement for 3 weeks, while the initial proceedings moved and the security assessment ran its course, and the Virelli Group's network contracted around its own arrests with the specific implosion of structures that had been built on fear and were now discovering that fear without enforcement was just a memory. Colt was alive. She found that out on the second day, from a man she didn't know who came to tell her. He'd been taken to a hospital from the Virelli estate with injuries that were serious but not final, which was the best version of what could have been true, and she held it there, in the category of things that had cost something and could have cost more. She visited him on the 4th day. He was in a room that smelled of antiseptic and plastic, and he was sitting up and eating something with the expression of a man who found the food inadequate but was not in a position to negotiate. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You're walking better." "My feet healed," she said. "Did it work?" "Most of it," she said. "Enough of it." He nodded and went back to eating. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and they were quiet for a while in the way of people who had been through something together that didn't require narration. "James Virelli," she said. "The investigator. Did you know about him?" Colt was quiet for a moment. "Damien told me. After." "Did you know when you were working for Damien?" "No." He said it simply. "But some things make more sense now." She nodded. Some things did. The Vail Holdings case became public 6 weeks after the Black Veil Gala. The financial press ran it first: the reconstructed insolvency, the manufactured collapse, the asset transfers predating the public filing. And from there it moved into the general press with the specific velocity of a story that was both complicated and simple at the same time. Complicated in its mechanisms and simple in its human shape. Powerful men had destroyed a family to protect their money and had gone on being powerful for 14 years afterward. The media needed a name for her and tried several before settling on something she found reductive, but chose not to fight because fighting it required energy she was directing elsewhere. She was directing it toward the Vail Foundation. The legal process for asset recovery was not simple and was not fast and was not the kind of thing that resolved in a single clean moment. What it was ongoing, a sustained structural project that required her to be present and specific and persistent in the way that building things required, which was different from the way destroying things required, and she was learning the difference in real time. She hired a lawyer. She hired a second lawyer. She read documents that were long and technical and frequently infuriating, and she read them anyway because the alternative was letting someone else read them for her, and she had learned, in the most expensive way available, what happened when you assumed the people managing your family's affairs were doing so in your interest. The estate in the Virelli building was, eventually, through a process she would not describe as simple, made available to her as part of the broader asset recovery framework. She did not move into it. She converted it. The conversion took 4 months and was the first thing she'd built rather than dismantled in 5 years. And the building under renovation was noisy and dusty and perpetually slightly wrong in the way that constructions were, and she was present for all of it. 6 months after the Black Veil Gala, on an evening in May when the city had finally decided to stop being cold about it, she was closing a small event at the foundation. Not a gala, nothing so grand, a working dinner for the attorneys and the researchers and the advocates who had been in the rooms with her, when she came outside and found him. She'd known he was in the city. She'd known from the proceedings, from the occasional information that reached her through the structural channels of the case. She'd known, and she hadn't sought it out, and she hadn't avoided it, and the result of those two equal forces had been a kind of equilibrium of waiting that she hadn't examined too closely. He was leaning against a car on the street outside. Not the black town car, not anything that announced itself. A regular car, the kind of car a person drove when they were not currently in the business of announcing what they were. He was in a dark jacket and no tie, and he looked like a man who had been through a significant rearrangement of himself and was part way through the reconstruction process. She stopped on the steps and looked at him. "You could have called," she said. "I could have," he said. She came down the steps. The May evening was mild and the street was quiet for this block at this hour, the particular urban quiet of a space between things. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him. He looked back. "The testimony," she said. "How was it?" "Long," he said. "Specific, necessary." A pause. "Hard." She nodded. She'd known it would be. She had not asked him to do it in a way that concealed what it would cost. "My father's attorneys are trying for diminished capacity," he said. "It won't work, but they're trying." "They'll try everything," she said. "That's their job." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The car beside him was running. She could hear the engine, low. "I've been in the proceedings infrastructure for 6 months. I needed—" He stopped, restarted more carefully. "I needed to be somewhere I was doing something useful, rather than somewhere I was being managed." She understood that. "Colt is working with me," he said, "on something new. Nothing like what it was, but something." "Good," she said, and meant it. The street held them both for a moment quietly. "You came to my house," he said, "to take my father down." "Yes," she said. "You used me. You invited me to a party to humiliate me in front of the people who killed my family," she said. "And then your father used you to flush me into the open. And your brother found me from a different direction and built a pathway into your house so I could find what was buried there." She looked at him levelly. "All of us use something. That's how we got here." He held her gaze. In the May evening, his face was a face she had been reading for 9 months, through various configurations of crisis and revelation and exhaustion and grief, and the specific kind of reconfiguration that happened to people when the story they'd told themselves about their own life turned out to have a different structure than the one they'd believed. She was, she thought, not the same person who had knelt on a marble floor cleaning grout at 10:30 on a Thursday night. She was not the same person who had lost her mother at 9, or her father at 19, or her name or her home, or the version of herself that had existed before. She was not the sum of what had been taken from her. She was not the mission either, the thing she'd built herself into for 5 years. She was whoever came after all of it, the person standing on a May sidewalk outside a building she'd converted with her grandmother's name above the door. She was finding out what that person was like. It was early yet. "You destroyed my entire empire," Damien said. There was something in it that was not quite an accusation and not quite the opposite. "Yes," she said. "You destroyed an empire that was built on your family's grave." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had moved through a long sequence of things and had arrived at something that was simpler and rawer than anything she'd seen there before, at the particular expression of a man who has lost everything that he was and is standing in the first months of finding out what he actually is without all of it. "Good thing you came," he said very quietly. She looked at him. He held out his hand, not a dramatic gesture, small, almost tentative, the gesture of someone offering something they weren't certain would be accepted and were offering anyway because not offering it was no longer the version of themselves they were interested in being. She looked at the hand. She thought about a marble floor at 10:30 at night, and a staircase, and a room full of laughter. She thought about Connecticut in the dark, and a ledge 14 inches wide, and a folder with 2 handwritten lines, and the drive with her data and his brother's case file layered together on the same piece of equipment. Two people who'd been working toward the same point from opposite directions and had never met, separated by 8 years in a rural road. She thought about May, the mild evening, the building behind her with its new sign. She took his hand, not like a maid, not like a weapon, not like the last heir of a destroyed dynasty, or the woman who'd spent 5 years building toward a single morning that tasted like exhaust and cold air, and the specific relief of something that had been in motion for too long finally finding its ground. Just like a person choosing, in the first evening of a long reconstruction, to not be alone in it. The car idled quietly at the curb. The city went on in every direction, indifferent and immense, and full of the ordinary noise of people living their lives in the long aftermath of things that had happened to them, making what they could of what remained. She held his hand and stood in the May evening and let the city be what it was, and that for now was enough.